She was called the beautiful widow of Countess. But beauty in her halls was not a gift. It was a death sentence. Torches flicker over blood-stained stones. The air smells of iron, not from the cages that line the walls, but from the blood that once dripped upon them. In the early 1600s, the mountains of northern Hungary concealed a secret empire of cruelty. Behind those fortress gates, young girls disappeared, their families bribed with gold and silence. They went to serve a noblewoman whose face never aged, whose gown shimmered crimson, and whose laughter, some said, echoed even after midnight. Her name was Countess Elizabeth Báthory. Her legend? A queen who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. But was it myth? Or a meticulously hidden horror, orchestrated by the most powerful woman in Eastern Europe? Sound builds, a heartbeat, a scream cut off mid-breath. This is not a fairy tale. This is the anatomy of power, vanity, and the darkness that thrives when no one dares to look behind the castle doors. You're watching Beyond the Known Files, where history bleeds through the shadows. Soft chime. Subscribe now, because what you're about to hear has been buried for 400 years. Before she became a monster in the eyes of Europe, she was a daughter of privilege, born into one of the most powerful dynasties in Hungary. Elizabeth Báthory entered the world in 1560, in the towering fortress of Bathory, surrounded by velvet iron and fear. Her bloodline was ancient, a mix of Transylvanian royalty and Hungarian aristocracy, woven together through generations of political marriages. From birth, she was told she was different, not merely noble, but untouchable. Her family's power stretched across borders. Her uncle was a warlord, her cousin, the Prince of Transylvania, and her aunt, a woman rumored to practice witchcraft versed in the dark arts of seduction and poison. In these lands, torn between the rising Ottoman Empire and the collapsing Holy Roman Sphere, cruelty was not a crime. It was a survival instinct. And Elizabeth learned early that pain could be power. At age 11, she was engaged to a soldier and nobleman named Ferenc Nadasdy, a union designed to preserve political dominance. By 15, she was married and sent to live in Countess Castle, a stone fortress looming over a quiet Slovak valley. The wedding was lavish. Hundreds of guests, rivers of wine, servants dressed in gold-threaded tunics. But beneath the ceremony's splendor, whispers lingered. Whispers of the young bride's temper, her fascination with anatomy, and her frequent fits of rage and fainting. The villagers spoke of how she struck her maids without reason, of how her eyes, deep and dark, seemed to linger too long on wounds. Ferenc, her husband, was no less brutal. Known as the Black Hero of Hungary, he commanded armies against the Ottomans and brought home more than trophies. He shared with Elizabeth his instruments of war, spiked whips, iron cages, and creative methods of discipline. What began as fascination became ritual. In the dim candlelight of Countess's halls, the young countess began keeping notes, experiments in obedience and punishment. To her, fear was beauty. To disobey was to invite suffering. But when Ferenc left for the battlefield, Elizabeth's impulses deepened. With power unchecked, she began to explore her curiosity, not on soldiers but on her servants. A simple slap became a cut. A cut became a test, and soon, Countess Castle became a laboratory of cruelty. Thunder rolls. Faint echo of a scream fades into the wind. But this was only the beginning. Before the iron cages, before the blood, before history's cruelest legend was born. When Ferenc Nadasdy rode to war, Elizabeth ruled alone, with hundreds of peasants under her command and a castle isolated by mountains. The world beyond Countess was brutal. The Ottoman wars had left villages empty, women widowed and food scarce. Superstition ruled where law could not reach, and in that void, Elizabeth's power became absolute. It began quietly. A scullery maid fell ill after angering the countess. Another ran away in the night, but the villagers knew better. They saw the black carriages at dawn, servants dumping something heavy into the frozen earth behind the castle walls. Dogs howled at the scent, and yet no one dared to speak, because who would accuse a Bathory? In her letters, Elizabeth called herself a guardian of order, but her methods were madness. She would inspect the servants' hands, and if one nail was unclean, that hand was burned in wax. A stain on a dress? Whipping until blood stained the floor. A misplaced needle? A cage. Iron, narrow, with spikes that kissed the skin when one breathed. She called it discipline, but witnesses later said it looked more like delight. One maid named Dorca was found trembling, claiming she had been forced to stand naked in snow while water was poured over her, until she froze solid like a statue. Elizabeth called it the ice angel, the music swells, heartbeat pace. Each new cruelty brought a twisted satisfaction. Each scream was a melody in her lonely castle. And then came the moment that would define the legend. One winter afternoon, a young maid accidentally tugged Elizabeth's hair while brushing it. Enraged, the Countess struck the girl so hard that blood splashed across her hand. Elizabeth stared at it, red, steaming, glistening against her pale skin. When she wiped it away, she thought she saw her reflection. Younger, smoother. From that day on, blood became her obsession. She began to record her findings, the temperature of the blood, its scent, how quickly it congealed, how it looked under candlelight. Soon, bathing in it became a ritual of vanity, a promise of eternal youth. And the castle servants? They became her victims one by one, at first peasant girls from nearby farms, then daughters of minor nobles, drawn in by the promise of courtly training never to return. The walls of Choctich began to breathe terror. And yet, no one outside dared to question it, because Elizabeth was royalty, and royalty in the eyes of the church and crown could not be evil, fade to silence. But this was only the first act. Soon, the death toll would rise into the hundreds, and the entire kingdom would be forced to face what was hidden behind those blood-soaked walls. By the turn of the century, the year 1602, Choctich Castle had become a theater of death. Not a battlefield, not a dungeon, but something far more ritualistic. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was performance. Elizabeth Báthory had perfected her cruelty the way an artist perfects her brushstroke. And each act was meant not just to destroy a life, but to celebrate her power over it. To the outside world, Elizabeth opened what she called a refinement academy, a finishing school for noble girls. Parents sent their daughters with pride, eager for their names to be associated with the Bathory prestige. But behind the stone gates, the lessons were very different. The girls were stripped, washed, measured. Their flaws, a stain, a freckle, a trembling hand, became excuses for torment. According to trial testimonies later collected by Count Georgi Thurzo, Elizabeth's trusted servants, Ilona Jo, Dorothea Szentes Dorca, Katalin Benica, and Janos Vivaria became her executioners. They obeyed without question. The methods were not merely cruel, they were ritualistic, almost liturgical in rhythm. Witnesses spoke of golden basins filled with the victim's blood. Elizabeth would undress in silence, step into the crimson pool, and close her eyes. Candles flickered around her. The only sound was the dripping of blood against the stone. She called it the red baptism. Sometimes she would laugh softly and say, "See how youth returns to me? How God has blessed my lineage." But it wasn't God watching her. It was the terrified eyes of the next girl in line. The castle's torture chambers, later discovered by Thurzo's men, contained iron cages that could suspend victims upside down, whips laced with metal hooks, branding irons shaped like serpents, a large wooden rack for stretching limbs until the bones cracked. It wasn't enough to kill. It had to be artful. The Countess demanded silence during her sessions. If the victim screamed too loudly, she would sew their lips shut. And when blood spilled across the marble, she didn't flinch. She smiled. How many died in Choctich Castle? Records vary. Some say 36, others 80. But one servant's testimony claimed she had seen the names of over 650 girls recorded in Elizabeth's own ledger, a book now lost to history, 650. Imagine that number. An entire village erased. A generation of daughters vanished into a noblewoman's madness. Did no one notice? Oh, they did. But they chose silence. Because Elizabeth wasn't a peasant witch, she was royalty. And royalty was protected. She hosted dinners for visiting nobles while the blood of her victims still soaked beneath the tiles. She attended church, received communion, and sat beside priests who blessed her without knowing, or perhaps pretending not to know, what she had done the night before. And as the legend spread, whispers grew louder. Was this woman human, or something darker? By 1604, Elizabeth's husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, was dead, and the Countess was alone with her servants and her rituals. She began to lose control. Witnesses claimed she would sometimes roam the castle halls at night, barefoot in a blood-stained gown, muttering prayers in Latin backwards. She began to see faces, the faces of her victims, and in every mirror. But the murders continued, even as noble families began to question why their daughters never returned. Even as rumors of bloodbaths reached the ear of King Matthias II himself, it was no longer possible to hide the bodies or the screams, and soon the hunters would become the hunted. The storm intensifies. A church bell tolls in the distance, but this was not the end of her reign. It was only the moment when the kingdom decided to look behind the curtain. In the heart of the Hungarian court, whispers of Countess Elizabeth Báthory's cruelty had finally reached the crown. And in a world ruled by power and appearances, even horror needed a political excuse to be seen. King Matthias II, ruler of Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire's uneasy vassal, had heard the stories years earlier: blood, cages, missing girls. But he hesitated. After all, Elizabeth was not just a noble woman. She was a Bathory, a family that had funded armies and fortified borders. To accuse her would mean destabilizing an entire aristocratic line, so Matthias chose silence until one of the missing girls turned out to be of noble blood. When the daughters of barons and minor lords vanished, the whispers became outrage. Letters began to circulate. One from Reverend István Magyari, a Lutheran preacher who dared to denounce the Countess from his pulpit. "What justice is there," he wrote, "when noble blood feasts upon innocence and the cross trembles in her hands?" The church demanded investigation, and this time the king could no longer pretend not to hear. Enter Count György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary, the king's right hand, and ironically, a relative by marriage to Elizabeth herself. His task: investigate the rumors quietly and, if necessary, end them. But Thurzó was no fool. He knew that touching a Bathory meant walking the edge of treason, so he gathered evidence slowly, methodically, interviewing peasants, priests, and surviving servants. What he heard painted a picture so monstrous that even hardened soldiers refused to believe it. One witness claimed the Countess had fed a girl pieces of her own flesh. Another swore she had seen bodies hung like butchered animals from the rafters. And yet Thurzó still needed proof. It came on a freezing night, December 30th, 1610. Torches flared against the snow as Thurzó's men surrounded the castle. Inside, servants panicked. Elizabeth's chamber doors were barricaded. When Thurzó forced them open, he froze. Before him lay one girl dead, another dying, and a third writhing on the floor, her body punctured by needles. The Countess stood nearby, serene, holding a handkerchief embroidered with her family crest, stained red. In the dungeons below, they found dozens of corpses, mutilated, drained, some half buried in lime. The air was so thick with decay that even the soldiers covered their faces. This was no rumor. It was hell carved in stone. Elizabeth Báthory was arrested that night, but the king faced a dilemma. How do you put royalty on trial without unraveling the entire order of nobility? The solution was silence, again disguised as justice. Elizabeth's servants were tortured and executed in public squares. Ilona Jo and Dorothea Sentes had their fingers torn off before being burned alive. János Újvári was decapitated. Katalin Benica, who cooperated, was sentenced to life imprisonment. But the Countess herself? She was never formally tried. Instead, she was confined within her own castle. Her rooms were walled up, windows bricked, doors sealed, with only a small slot left for food and air. For 4 years, she lived in that darkness, alone with the ghosts of her victims. The king called it justice. But historians know it was politics. King Matthias demanded that Elizabeth's lands and wealth be confiscated to repay her debts. In truth, he owed money to the Bathory family, and her downfall was the perfect solution. Power devoured its own, and her trial became a spectacle of convenience. Because if the nobles could convince themselves that Elizabeth was an exception, They could continue pretending that the world of aristocracy was not built upon the same cruelty, only hidden better. Sound fades into a low, echoing heartbeat, but even in her sealed chamber the Countess's legend grew. Her crimes became myths. Her name immortalized not in nobility but in nightmare. And yet, the story wasn't finished, because where the truth ended, the myths began. Darker, stranger, and far more enduring than fact. When the castle walls sealed around Elizabeth Báthory, the woman disappeared. But the legend began to breathe, because the world doesn't let monsters die quietly. It needs them. It shapes them, exaggerates them, turns them into cautionary tales, so that humanity can look away from its own reflection. The first wave of stories came from her guards, her interrogators, and the priests who carried food to her sealed chamber. They swore they heard her laughing in the dark, whispering the names of her victims. They said the walls themselves bled. Within a year of her death in 1614, pamphlets spread across Europe calling her the Blood Countess. They claimed she had bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it restored her youth. They said her mirrors shattered when she tried to see her reflection, that the devil himself had appeared in her room the night she died. But how much was truth? And how much was theater? In the 18th and 19th centuries, her story fused with a rising obsession in Europe, vampirism. Writers began to compare her to creatures of eternal youth who fed on blood. In 1729, a Jesuit scholar named Laszlo Turoczi published Tragica Historia, describing Elizabeth as a literal vampire. He wrote, "She believed the blood of the innocent could wash away the decay of time." By the 1800s, Gothic writers across Europe had turned her legend into inspiration. It's no coincidence that Bram Stoker, author of Dracula 1897, drew heavily on tales from Transylvania and Hungary, the same region where Bathory's shadow still lingered. Elizabeth became not just a murderer, but the mother of the female vampire archetype. One of the most grotesque myths tied to her name emerged. Centuries later, the story of the Iron Maiden, a spiked coffin allegedly used by the Countess to drain her victim's blood. It wasn't real. The Iron Maiden itself is a Victorian fabrication, a sensational museum invention from the 1800s, but it fit the narrative so well that it became inseparable from her legend, because the idea of a beautiful woman hiding horror within a gilded shell was irresistible. She wasn't just a killer anymore. She was sin incarnate. Modern historians like Dr. Irma Sadecki-Kardos and Tony Thorne have suggested something far colder, that the legend exaggerated her crimes, whereby that perhaps she was framed. Think about it. A widowed noblewoman, wealthy beyond measure, controlling vast lands in a patriarchal empire that distrusted powerful women. It wouldn't be the first time that ambition was rewritten as madness. Records show that some witnesses were tortured before confessing. Many testimonies were hearsay, collected from terrified peasants promised freedom. And the infamous ledger of 650 victims, never found so. Was she truly a blood-soaked predator, or a convenient scapegoat sacrificed to politics and folklore? The answer lies buried beneath centuries of myth-making and fear. Even today, Elizabeth Báthory's image endures. In films, novels, heavy metal lyrics, even perfumes named after her. She has become a symbol of vanity, power, and the corruption of privilege. Some call her the first female serial killer. Others, a feminist icon turned to demon by patriarchy. But whichever story you believe, her legend still feeds on what it always has, our fascination with beauty and blood, because it wasn't really about immortality. It was about control, and that is far darker than any myth. But time eventually erodes even fear. And as the candles burned out in Countess Castle, the world began to forget, until the ruins whispered again centuries later, when historians asked what truly killed the Blood Countess, her crimes, or the lies built around them. After her death in August 1614, Elizabeth Báthory was buried in an unmarked grave. The location was kept secret, for fear that villagers might dig up her body and burn it. Her castle was abandoned, its windows shattered by wind, its halls left to rot. But her story refused to die. In the Enlightenment centuries that followed, philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot used her legend to question the morality of aristocracy. They asked, how much cruelty is tolerated when it's gilded with power? Hungarian poet László Arany later wrote, the Countess did not invent cruelty, she only mirrored her world. Because the Hungary of the 16th century was soaked in blood long before Elizabeth drew her first breath. War, torture, execution, all sanctioned by kings and churches alike. She merely took what the world already worshipped and made it personal. Her downfall also marked the twilight of the feudal world that had created her. By the mid-1600s, the Ottoman threat receded, the nobility weakened, and the age of reason began to whisper that superstition and divine hierarchy could no longer hide human evil. The peasants who once bowed before her name began telling ghost stories by firelight of a queen who drank youth and slept in blood. It was horror, yes, but also rebellion, the powerless finally mocking their masters. Modern scholars remain divided. Was she a sadist? A victim of patriarchal politics? Or a legend built from fragments of fear and envy? Records were rewritten, testimonies destroyed. The church had motive. The king had debts, and history, as always, belonged to the victors. So when we look back, what do we really see? A monster, or a mirror? By the 18th century, Choctaw Castle was nothing but stone and wind. Travelers wrote of a place haunted by voices and the smell of iron. Villagers refused to climb the hill after sunset. Today, tourists wander those ruins. They touch the cold walls and wonder if the legend was real, if the stones still remember the screams, or if those screams were invented to make sense of a woman who had too much power for her time, because whether she killed 100 girls, or none at all, the world made sure her name would bleed forever. But history's greatest monsters are rarely born, they're built. Brick by brick, lie by lie, until even truth becomes decoration. And as Choctaw crumbled, Elizabeth Báthory became exactly what her world wanted her to be. Not a woman, not a ruler, but a warning. 4 centuries later, her castle still stands, skeletal, silent, and patient. Grass grows through the cracks where blood once flowed. The wind whispers her name not as a curse, but as a question. Who was Elizabeth Báthory, really? A sadist who drowned in her own vanity? A brilliant woman destroyed by men who feared her? Or something far more tragic, the embodiment of a society addicted to cruelty disguised as power? It wasn't just about beauty. It wasn't just about death. It was about control. Because every civilization has its ritual spectacles, the things it hides behind silk and ceremony. In Elizabeth's Hungary, it was torture disguised as discipline. In ours, perhaps it's the spectacle of judgment, of scandal, of watching others fall to make ourselves feel righteous. History's stage never really closes. It just changes its costume. When people hear of the Blood Countess, they recoil. How could someone do such things? But the real question is darker. How could so many watch and say nothing? The guards who obeyed, the nobles who ignored, the church that blessed, the king who profited. Monsters like Elizabeth don't rise alone. They are built, brick by brick, silence by silence. And when we refuse to look, when we excuse cruelty for comfort or power, we too become the walls that keep her legend alive. In 1614, when they found her body inside her walled chamber, her face was said to be peaceful, untouched by time. Some swore she looked 20 years younger. Others said she had clawed at the stones until her fingers broke. No one truly knows. But one truth remains. The woman who sought eternal youth found it, not in flesh, but in fear. Because every century someone still whispers her name, and somewhere another storyteller lights a candle to tell it again. This wasn't just spectacle. It was control. And that's why it still matters. You've been watching Beyond the Known Files, where history hides its darkest secrets in plain sight. If you were drawn into this story, subscribe to the channel for more tales of power, madness, and the human soul at its breaking point, and tell me in the comments, which part of Elizabeth Báthory's story do you think reveals the darkest soul of civilization? The blood or the silence?